We're going to compute a predetermined overhead rate and use that predetermined overhead rate to apply overhead to a job. Computing a predetermined overhead rate is a three-step process. The first step involves estimating the level of production or output we expect for the coming period. Next, we estimate the total amount of allocation base in the denominator that would be required for that level of production. In other words, how many direct labor hours do we think we would need to work for that level of output? How many machine hours would we need to have that level of output? And then finally, we estimate the total manufacturing overhead cost in the numerator that would be incurred for that level of estimated allocation base. In other words, how much overhead do we expect to incur based on the number of direct labor hours we plan to work. Then finally, we simply calculate our predetermined overhead rate by taking our estimated manufacturing cost and dividing it by the allocation base for that particular period. So again, our predetermined overhead rate is determined before the year begins based on estimated total manufacturing overhead cost divided by some estimated activity level for the coming period. And again, ideally, the allocation base or cost driver is something that drives our overhead, that's causing us to incur the overhead that we're going to use to produce our level of output. Applying manufacturing overhead to jobs then is a simple two-step process of taking our predetermined overhead rate that we estimated before the year began and multiplying it by the actual level of activity associated with that job. Again, if we were setting bid prices or bidding on jobs, we would take our predetermined overhead rate and multiply it by some estimated level of activity that we would expect to incur on that particular job. Let's go ahead and look at an example. Let's assume that the parent company expects to incur $640,000 in manufacturing overhead costs during the coming period and work 160,000 direct labor hours. We would calculate our predetermined overhead rate then as $4 per direct labor hour, and for every hour we worked on a particular job, we would apply $4 in overhead to that job. Let's go ahead and take a look at a job cost sheet. Let's assume that this particular job, job A143, had incurred $8 in direct labor hours, or 8 hours of direct labor. Then we would apply 8 hours of overhead at a rate of $4 per hour, and we would charge that job, or allocate to that job, $32 in overhead. If we wanted to look at a summary of costs for that particular job, we would pick up our direct materials from our job cost sheet of $116, our direct labor of $88, and then our applied manufacturing overhead of $32. Again, that was our 8 hours of direct labor multiplied by our predetermined overhead rate of $4 per hour. If we take our total unit cost then of $236 and divide it by our 2 units, we get a unit cost of $118 per unit. Again, that's our average cost per unit is $118 per unit. We want to be careful in interpreting that $118 average cost per unit. That's not the actual cost that would be incurred if we were to produce one more unit. Our actual cost is likely to be somewhat less than $118 because our fixed overhead cost would not change if we produced another unit. But in spreading that cost out over more units, our average cost per unit would decrease. Let's work through an example. Let's assume that on September 1, we have estimates of the following month for manufacturing overhead of $17,000 and estimated direct labor hours of 13,600. And then during September, we had some actual results. Manufacturing overhead was 18,500 and actual direct labor hours were $12,000, or hours rather. Let's go ahead and calculate our predetermined overhead rate, which recall was our estimated manufacturing overhead cost of $17,000 divided by our estimated direct labor hours of 13,600. So we get a predetermined overhead rate of $1.25 per direct labor hour. If on a particular job we worked 12,000 actual direct labor hours, we would multiply that by our predetermined overhead rate of $1.25 per direct labor hour, and we would assign or allocate to that job $15,000 in manufacturing overhead. If we applied $15,000 in overhead to the job, that would be a credit to manufacturing overhead and a debit to work in process. We are told, recall, that our actual overhead was $18,500. This means that we have $13,500 in under-applied overhead for the period. Let's look at one more concept check question. At Northwest Fabricators, job WR53 required $200 of direct materials in the period, 10 direct labor hours at $15 per hour, and our estimated overhead for the year was $760,000, and estimated direct labor hours were 20,000. What would record as the cost of job WR53? The first step will be calculate our predetermined overhead rate. So we'll take our $760,000 in estimated cost and divide it by our direct labor hours to get our predetermined overhead rate. Once you've done that, add up our direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Our estimated total cost for the job is $730. We take our direct materials of $200 plus $150 in direct labor, that was 10 hours at $15 per hour, and we multiply again that same 10 hours by our predetermined overhead rate of $38 per hour.